Are you tired of your valuable ideas and suggestions getting lost in the shuffle? Well, that is why I'm introducing Direct Suggest, the revolutionary digital suggestion box that puts your voice front and center. With Direct Suggest, you have the power to make a difference in your organization. Direct Suggest provides value to organizations in various industries worldwide, including notable brands like Comcast, TD Bank, and Nokia. And here's the best part. Direct Suggest only costs 50 cents per employee per month, making it an affordable solution for businesses of all sizes. Plus, they have an incredibly high ROI and savings potential with an average 33 times return on investment. The implementation process is also a breeze. Once committed, setting up Direct Suggest from start to finish can be completed in as quickly as a week or less. Don't let your ideas or your team's ideas go unnoticed. Visit directsuggest.com today and start by making a difference with Direct Suggest. Use the promo code HUMANHR for your extended 60-day free trial. Again, visit directsuggest.com to learn more, and remember to use promo code HUMANHR for an extended free trial. Direct Suggest, where your voice matters. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. I'm really excited to dive into this week's topic with this week's guest, not only because it's something that I do think will help us to more tangibly understand some of the topics that we've been talking about in the last few weeks, but also because it's so humanizing. So let's jump in. This week, I have Lisa Nichols with me, who is the founder and CEO of Lisa Nichols Consulting, an employee engagement and retention firm that helps leaders cultivate thriving workplaces. With a career spanning both the nonprofit and corporate sectors, Lisa has become a trusted mentor to leaders at every stage of their careers. Her unique perspective is informed by her multicultural and multilingual experience, equipping her to guide leaders in creating environments that inspire employees to advocate for themselves and do their best work. Lisa's 3C method helps leaders establish a foundation of compassion, connection, and communication for their teams, enhancing productivity, morale, and retention, which is really, honestly, the perfect place for us to end your bio, Lisa, because this is the first thing that we're going to talk about. So first of all, welcome to the podcast. And secondly, please help us to understand your 3C method and where it came from.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And the 3C method really grew out of my own background. I have been coaching leaders for over 16 years and helping people navigate career changes and challenges. And in that time, as I worked, especially in the last several years, I was working with people who, there were a lot of common themes that we were discussing. And they weren't new things. They were things that have been discussed for a lot of years, right? But a lot of the challenges facing like big changes and transitions in the workplace, and how do you lead your team through change, how to reduce burnout, how to really bridge some generational and cultural gaps. And in all of this, even with all of the conversations that we've been having about psychological safety, about, inclusion and belonging, about all of these different areas, it seemed like something is still missing, because we're still having the conversations. And I wanted to really get to the bottom of what that was and address some of those core issues. And so that's where the 3C method came from, is that I identified some of these core issues that seem to be part of these challenges are a lack of compassion, some like a lack of connection among team members. And because of that, a lot of flawed communication. And so those are the 3 C's, right? We start with compassion as the foundation, because without compassion and trying to understand someone else's perspective, it's really not possible to have that authentic connection. And for me, and what I've experienced and learned for myself, I firmly believe that it starts with self compassion,
Hmm.
because there's something about understanding and identifying what you need for yourself, and showing yourself compassion that allows you then to have a different perspective in the way you view others,
Yeah.
and helping them to be free to be who they are and where they are, um, and to build that connection authentically. And so then the more connected that teams are, it just transforms the way that we communicate as well, um, which is all so essential, especially when we're talking about things like major changes and when you're leading a team through change, you know. And so that compassion, connection, and communication is the foundation that we can build from.
Right. No, I mean, it's funny because maybe it's not so funny, but it's funny because, when, at least when I think about, let's say, a challenge that often comes up for people, whether they're employees or employers, and, depending on where they are in an organization, so much of where their concern lies can be solved with this model. So I think the funny part for me is that I guess it's so easy to understand when you break it down the way that you have. And it's also, in a way, so obvious. Like, you're taking what exists as a challenge and you're saying, hello, like, obviously we can solve for this through these three things. And
Mm.
I really appreciate that you talked about self-compassion, because it kind of I'm a little nostalgic. It brings me back to when I first started this podcast, and I was like, give yourself space and grace. So for anyone listening who maybe is like an OG and has been here for almost 4 years, you might remember that. And I was saying that a lot in the lens of, or through the lens of, COVID and all of the things that we
Mm-hmm.
as HR people were confronted with, like new territory, uncharted waters, in the sense of, now managing a workforce that's remote or hybrid, or having to think about personal safety and PPE and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all of this really can be applied to present day, post COVID environments. And so one of the things that I thought I was maybe curious about, and I thought about asking you, was this idea of really environmental differences, let's say. So if
Mm.
an employee or a company works hybridly or remotely, how these things, or I should say, how connection might be affected
Mm-hmm.
in a different way, or how these problems may be more challenging to solve. Like, do you see a trend amongst those types of
Mm-hmm.
environments?
I definitely do. I hear a lot of, like, that's what I've been hearing for several years, right? Like, leaders are saying, how do we build team connection? We're all in different places, or maybe we're hybrid, so we're not all in the office at the same time. But the interesting thing is, I think that people also who are now have returned to the office and are in the office at the same time, they're facing similar challenges as well.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure that it's as much about proximity as we feel like it is. But that being said, that is what we feel. We feel like, how
Mm-hmm.
can we connect when we're not in the same space?
Right.
And so it's a really big question. Um, I believe it takes intentionality. And sometimes it's simple things. Like, I remember a few years ago talking to a leader, a team leader, who said, they were all remote, right? And they said, oh, we're trying to do like some happy hours. We're trying to do things to connect people. And my question was, what are you doing like during the workday to give people space to like connect,
Mm-hmm.
collaborate, like work together. And they weren't really doing a lot of that. So then if you're having a happy hour, you're asking someone to take time in the evening outside of work to
Mm-hmm.
hang out with strangers, basically. So I think that that's one of the things is just being intentional and giving people that space as part of the workday and making those connections where, people are working together, which it takes some planning and some strategizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're not in the same place, it can feel like it takes more. But I would say that what I hear also from people who are back, in the same office, there's still a challenge because either people are like, oh, I mean, people have told me I can't get anything done because people are coming in my office all the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really great. They are connecting, but they're connecting in a different way than they used to, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other people who say, I'm in the office, but we're just all in our own separate spaces and we don't really interact. Why are we even there?
Right.
So I think it takes a lot of like being intentional about creating those opportunities.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And as you were sharing and talking about this, I also realized that whether you're remote or in person or hybrid, those same challenges can still exist. And I think you touched on that in the perspective of saying that everything requires intention and thought. And so I'm curious, are I is the implementation of this model and kind of being intentional about connection, is this top down, is it bottom up, is it everyone
Mm-hmm.
has an impact, is it HR, is it leaders, who has the most influence over this?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think, for a lot of organizations, that's what organizations are working through. Who's responsible for this? Where does it come from? From my experience, what I've found is that it's most impactful when it is coming from the top down, um, but also in a way that allows for like bottom up, right? So it's kind of like the sandwich thing, because really, if leadership is not completely like, if they're not directing this and saying this is where we need to go, we need to be intentional about this, then there ends up being a disconnect. And so if people, are trying to go bottom up and they're trying to implement these things, they usually will reach a point where they can't do anything
Mm-hmm.
because there's not that
Mm-hmm.
support. So it definitely has to be supported by leadership, but also in a way that you're empowering people to be able to, at all levels, to be able to impact it.
So one of the things that I was thinking about, just in a similar vein, but a little bit in a kind of taking a different approach here, was this idea of compassion, because so much of the outreach that I do get from listeners touches on leaders having either a lack of empathy or needing more empathy. It obviously comes out in different ways. And I know one of the core aspects that you reference under the compassion in the 3C model, so that being the first C, is curiosity and kindness. Those are the two other core aspects other than empathy. And so I was curious, here we go with curiosity. I was curious um, kind of how you approach teams where maybe you have, let's say you have a group of 5 leaders and the CEO is one of them. And the CEO feels really strongly that compassion is a really important part of cultivating, whether it is a positive culture, more connectedness, harnessing these 3 C's. But then maybe there are 2 leaders. So now you have, 2 out of the remaining 4, 50% potentially, who really don't necessarily value or inherently have this ability to demonstrate empathy. What do you how do you approach that problem? And how is there a way for you, or how do you instill empathy within leaders maybe who don't value it or who lack the ability to demonstrate it?
Well, it's definitely something that can be cultivated in people. But I do think when you're dealing with a situation where it's not valued, you may not be able, I mean, we can't change what someone values necessarily. We can, of course, try to show them the benefits of it. And for me, again, it goes back to the self-compassion piece, because what I find often is that leaders who may seem like they're not really valuing that compassion or that empathy, a lot of times they're not feeling it for themselves, or they think that they shouldn't have any either. And it really starts there. So if you're looking at like a change management situation where a leader is tasked with implementing some type of change, if they might feel frustrated, overwhelmed, they may not even agree with it, but you can often get leaders who will be like, it doesn't matter what I feel, I have to do it. This is how it is, right? And they're not even allowing themselves to really feel how it's affecting them. And so if they're in that space, they're not able to have that empathy for other people, because they're like, well, I don't like it either. I'm just doing it. Why can't they do it? You know what I mean? And so that's where I am such a big believer in starting with yourself and really identifying, what am I feeling about this? How is this affecting my job? I'm sure you probably have been in this situation where you might think, like, I don't know, all these people are going to be frustrated and they're going to be complaining to me, and it's not even my fault, but I have to implement it, right? And that's really stressful. That's a hard situation to be in. And it's even harder if you don't believe in the change or like the change yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I was thinking about how one of the core tenets of the compassion portion of the 3C model is curiosity. And I like that because, I think with compassion, people tend to lean toward, okay, you have to be empathetic, you have to be kind, you have to be considerate. But being compassionate also means that you're interested in understanding maybe someone else's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You're curious to know how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that might not initially feel like it's demonstrating empathy, but it really is. And I can think of a handful of leaders who I've worked with in the past who maybe struggled with the empathy portion of these, really competencies, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But they never lacked the ability to ask questions. They never
Mm-hmm.
lacked the ability to find something really to connect on. And so it's what I think is really effective about how you've laid this out, not only for us as we learn through your model today on this podcast, but just in general, is that you can have or be really good at one thing
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately need to develop the other in order to make this, trifecta work the best way possible, and in a way that's most effective for you and an organization. So I think it's interesting. And then also something that I realized is that if you effectively are working with a client on
Mm-hmm.
this, like at some level there's a need, and at some level there's a belief that this can help to either cultivate a strong culture or improve on some of the challenges that a business is maybe faced with. So
Mm-hmm.
that's like always a good step when someone is, really in this case, like hiring you to help them and consult on the challenges within their environments.
Yes.
That's my takeaway.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. I think that that's absolutely true. And definitely it's why when people ask, like, what type of companies or organizations do I work with? I always say it's really about are they committed to these things? Are they excited about improving the compassion, the connection, and the communication in their teams and their people and supporting their people? Because if they are, then it's a good fit. And it's much more about
Mm-hmm.
that than about industry or, anything else, is really that commitment.
Totally.
Mhm.
Right. I love that. Another really strong C
Yes.
for that we could build into this, I suppose. Something that I know you do a lot of, I guess, like ideating on, and something that you talk about and that we've talked about before even recording, was the impact that generational differences have on workplaces. And I think I had shared with you previously when we met that this is a topic that I've touched on maybe once on the
Mm-hmm.
podcast, maybe a couple times. I'll be generous, maybe a couple times. And the reality is that there are a lot of differences in the workforce today. There are people across so many generations, and because of that, there are very unique challenges that come from generational gaps or differences. So just, I guess, when you look at it maybe more generally, what are some of the bigger differences that exist as a result of having multiple generations within a workforce? And to bookend that, I suppose, what are some of the things that leaders should be considering when they're making decisions as it relates to generational differences?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. There are so many generations in the workforce right now, and this is more than we've had in the past. The extent, because people are staying in the workforce longer, and the differences in generations, this is not a new conversation at all. I remember hearing about this before I was even in the workforce. This is something that is very common. And what I think is really interesting is that some of the things that we attribute to generational differences may not so much be generational as they are like stage of life differences.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
because people, if you go back in time, you see similar conversations about previous generations, like whatever generation is the emerging, the one emerging into the workforce, there are some common themes and things that are said about these generations. And it's been happening at least for the past few. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is something that often gets overlooked, because I don't hear a lot of people talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is a reality that when you're at a certain stage of life, different things, you value things, different things maybe, or you're just at a different place. So that's one aspect. Uh, as far as what leaders can do and what they should be thinking about, again, this ties back to me, it ties back to that curiosity and understanding, because our tendency can be to, we all have heard certain talking points, things that people just always say about different generations, like those stereotypes or whatever. And there's some truth to them, right? But also, we
Right.
don't often ask, well, why would this generation be saying this or acting in this way? What has caused this? What factors in their lives have made this a conversation for them? So I think that the curiosity, if leaders are curious about, or fostering that curiosity among the entire team, so people are not only looking at it from one side, but they're able to say, I wonder why this person would approach things this way. And I think that curiosity is very important, because if you have an understanding of why someone has a certain perspective, then it helps you to have a conversation and not just to
Mm-hmm.
judge. And that's why
Right.
Curiosity is like the opposite of judgment. So instead of judging ourselves or others, if we're curious about it, we can get a lot further with the conversation.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I really appreciate that you mentioned curiosity as as oppositional to
Mhm.
judgment, because I think it's very easy probably for anyone and everyone to just jump to some sort of assumption or conclusion rather than asking more clarifying questions.
Mhm.
Or and I know that that's also part of the connection, or excuse me, the communication C in the 3C model,
Mhm.
is the clarity portion, because clarity of course can help either the receiving party to understand what is being communicated, or it can help to the person delivering a message or trying to think about how they're going to deliver a message to better understand who their audience is.
Mhm.
So that makes a lot of sense. And this is, again, it's really underpinning what I said in the beginning, that this your model and what you've shared with us today really does allow us to have a much more concrete understanding of how we can approach challenges in our businesses, in our organizations, especially for those of us who are in HR or senior or leadership positions, excuse me, because we often are the ones that maybe are kind of holding the focus
Mhm.
on who the audience is, who we need to tailor our message to, how to coach and drive leaders to make different changes. So I think it's really helpful for us to actually kind of end there and allow the listeners to reflect on all of that.
Mhm.
So thank you so much for sharing not only your 3C model with us, but also what underpins the 3C model and how people can actually use it in their day to day. So, with that, I know that there's something special that you want to share with the listeners,
Yes.
and I'd love for you to share with the listeners where they can find you if they want to learn more or bring you to their organization. So, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do have a free download for your listeners. So if anyone wants to access it, you just go to my website, lisanicholsconsulting.com/humanhr. And there are some reflection and connection questions that I have there that can help you. So the reflection side, to questions to ask yourself, maybe journal about, and then the connection questions are things that you can ask your team members, the people that you're working with. So feel free to pick that up. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Lisa C. Nichols on LinkedIn. That's my, linkedin.com/in/Lisa C. Nichols, which I'm sure will be in the notes. And I'd love to connect with you there. On Instagram, you can follow me at Love Your Niche. And I would love to hear from you as well. So feel free to reach out and connect.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing all of that. And for the listeners, everything will be linked in the show notes. So if you don't have a pen and paper or your notes app handy, don't worry. We'll make sure it's very easy for you to connect with Lisa and also to claim your free download, which is so exciting. I love when the listeners get something for free. So, Lisa, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast, for joining us this weekend, again, for giving us some concrete, tangible things that we can use in our everyday.
Thanks so much, Tracy.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.